Did that convince you?
Well, I think it's a start. My concern is that if he's going to carry on doing carry on with Labour policies for another year, then the national deficit is going to rise and we could end up in really serious problems. And so, whilst he may have a point, I'm not entirely convinced, no.
Yes. Let me just add to that, because you've outlined 15 billion in cuts. Yeah. Nick Clegg apparently aspires to cut the structural deficit by half, and that's about, I think, 35 billion?
Well, the structural deficit is 70 to 80.
So if you cut it by half,
is about 35.
Yeah. So where is the extra 20 billion going to come from?
We start with the government's already taken.
You've told us the 15. We'll bank that.
That's right.
Where's the extra 20?
Well, the government's already already introduced things. That's what the whole argument about national insurance has been all about. We didn't like the national insurance tax, but it's happened unless you have some mechanism for getting rid of it. So we're effectively saying we have to take that as given. The government has taken certain steps. Our cuts are over and above that. And that takes us within shouting distance of halving the deficit in the next Parliament.
But surely you need an extra 20 billion.
Well, you certainly need more.
Well, I just wanted to hear what your plans are.
Well, over and above the 15 billion, we fully accept that there's got to be more. And
sorry, I feel I'm repeating myself like a worn-out record.
Yes,
I just want to know.
Well, it wasn't 20 because I've already explained that the government have already introduced tax increases and some specific spending cuts. Some of them were just vague waste saving. The government's already gone up quite a long way to dealing with the structural deficit. We suggest further measures to deal with it. And we fully accept that there's more that has to happen beyond that. That's why we've raised very tricky issues like the future of public sector pensions, big defence contracts that are going to have to be reopened.
And the other thing I'm just not quite clear about is whether you want to halve the structural deficit or get rid of it.
Well, we want to get rid of it, but the question is the time period with which you do it. And halving it within the next Parliament seemed to us a reasonable objective. It may well be that one has to do more quicker, but it seemed to us as a reasonable starting point, that's what we should be able to do.
So your economic policy is no different then from Labour's?
On that very narrow issue, we take that as a reasonable working assumption. It may well be that there will be pressure from the markets to do more and to do it sooner. But we say it's a working assumption. Nobody knows what the world is going to be like in 4 or 5 years' time. But let's set ourselves that objective. Let's be very clear about how we're going to do it.
And just to be clear, we won't know the precise details of that until after the election.
Of course you won't, because what would have to happen with any incoming government, ourselves, we would have a spending review, and you'd obviously have to look further in terms of what's got to happen. But we've gone considerably further than any other political party in selling out specifics in terms of what has to be done.
So, in fact, then, you are we're no more clear about your plans than we are about the Tories'
You're
plans.
a lot more clear about them. When you had a questionnaire from the public a few minutes ago, I spent several minutes going through the list. We didn't go through all of it. Nobody else has come anywhere close to identify that.
Yes, I know, and you were very specific about the 15 billion, but there is other cuts that are needed, and that we won't know about until you're in government, just as we won't know from Labour, just as we know from the Conservatives.
I've just given you a couple of specific areas. I think we accept, and in fact the other parties, to be fair to them, accept this too, that there's got to be reform of public sector pensions.
All right,
and there is a very important issue too, which is there has to be a rapid defence review. We've got committed to very large numbers of defence contracts the country cannot afford. They've got to be reviewed quickly, and some of them will have to be cut.
OK, let's speak to Alexandra Saxon, who is in Swindon for us now. Alexandra.
Hello. With talk of major public spending cuts, how can I be assured that these won't affect my family?
Very simple question. Alexandra, thank you very much for that. You're not ring-fencing any budgets, are you?
Well, I can't give you that assurance, because I think any politician who's been honest with you and who accepts the fact that there are going to be very substantial discipline in public spending has got to acknowledge that it could affect your budget. Of course it could. It could affect all of us. We have a major national problem, and we've got to be straight with you about the fact that this is going to be very difficult. So there may well be items which are of concern to you as an individual that will be affected. Just on the list that I gave your colleague a few moments ago, it's something like the Child Trust Fund. It's probably something you value. A lot of families value it, but when the country is in serious financial difficulty, we simply cannot afford to continue to put money into it. So I can't give you a cast iron guarantee that everything that you care about is going to be protected. What I will say is that there are certain things that we do care particularly about, and where we do think additional resources could go, and one of them is into the school system, and particularly into the primary sector.
OK, so when David Laws was talking about the NHS budget being ring-fenced and international development being ring-fenced, he was off message.
It wasn't correct. No, we are looking at everything. Yeah.
All right, OK, very good. Well, that's very clear. I just wondered whether we could talk about another issue now and bring in John Baxter, who is in Berwick-upon-Tweed for us, up in the borders there. John, I think you've got a question for Vince Cable.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Cable. My vote in the coming election is very important to me, and I have given consideration to voting for Lib Dem. But before I commit myself, I have to be sure where you would stand. In the event of a hung parliament, where would your party be? Will you join Labour or will you join Conservative?
I can't answer that question because it's not the Liberal Democrats who decide who the next election should be. You will decide it by the votes you cast, and the number of MPs, the number of votes is what will determine the outcome. And what we're doing at this stage is competing to persuade you in the merits of the argument. What we are saying is that many of the problems we confront, particularly this enormous problem of the public sector deficit and debt, is a massive national problem, and politicians are going to have to work together to deal with it, not in terms of old-fashioned tribal politics. And what we have said is that in the event of a hung parliament, but indeed under any parliament, what we're going to have to do is to sit down with the other major parties, work out what is the scale of that problem, how quickly it can be dealt with, how we coordinate it with the work of the Bank of England in respect of monetary policy, how we work with the banking system to get us out of this position. So there's got to be a common working between the parties over these fundamentals.
Mr. Cable, I'm very interested in something that Nick Clegg said that today about that a hung parliament would be the best outcome for Britain, and that there could be serious social strife if the Conservatives or Labour are elected with a small majority. So hung parliaments are better than governments with small majorities?
What he was saying was that if you do have a hung parliament situation, parties will be forced to work together, whether they like it or not. And it goes against the British tradition of Punch and Judy politics, but parties will be forced to work together.
Well, you look back to 78, 79. Was that a great example of parties working together during the Lib-Lab Pact? Oh, and you had the winter of discontent?
It wasn't a very, very different situation. We're now 3 decades on. The third party, ourselves, is in a much, much stronger position. And we're starting out arguing that our overriding responsibility is to look after financial responsibility, of financial prudence, which is a key element in our campaigning. The point Nick was stressing when he was talking about the Greek example, there is a real danger that you get a party winning this election with the support of no more than 1 in 4 of the electorate. That's the arithmetic, if you have a 40% vote and 60% turnout. And that party will be then trying to put through some very, very unpopular, controversial policies, which they haven't discussed with the electorate. You know, this whole issue about how you deal with the deficit has not been dealt with by the Tories or Labour, and there will be a very severe reaction to that.
Right. I just want to ask you one other question, because the interview has focused on positive versus negative campaigning. Story in the Sunday Times today that Labour have sent out leaflets targeted to people who may have been cancer sufferers, talking about, well, your treatment may suffer if there was a Conservative government. I just wonder what your reaction is to that.
Well, if what this story is true, that they've got individual data which is then targeted at cancer sufferers, then that is very grubby. There needs to be a proper investigation to find out if there has been abuse. I mean, I feel strongly that's because my late wife died of cancer. We lived with this for 14, 15 years, and if we'd received cards on an individual basis trying to make party politics out of it, we'd have been very angry indeed. Now, of course, there's an argument about cancer policy, and politicians are perfectly entitled to say, you know, let's have better screening, let's have better cancer drugs, but targeting individuals does seem to be rather disreputable if that's what's happened.
Vince Cable, grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now, here on the Politics Show, we understand that you're busy people, that many of you even have lives. What a thought. It's just possible, then, that you missed something in the week of the election campaign. Luckily, we've forced Max Cotton to watch all 121 hours of campaign coverage, really that much, every speech, stunt and photo opportunity. So here he is with his unique and not altogether serious take on the week.
So we've had a whole week of the election campaign, a week of having our intelligence insulted by image management. That's politicians managing our impression of them.